Welcome back with a smiling face. Important note before starting: if you are a fan of audio stories, then our Patreon account is the best platform for you. Join us on Patreon for the best audiobooks ever. Luna's Resurgence. Blurb. Lucinda, an 18-year-old wolfless Luna, survived and rescued her pack's remaining females and children from a killer by an invading alpha. Given sanctuary by another pack in secret to keep them safe. 8 years later, Lucinda, now an expert in bladed weapons and compound bows, finds herself fated to her second chance mate. An imposing alpha whose thoughts on Luna's a little more than off, only interested in a mate if they can create him a strong heir. Will he learn how to love and bond to a fated mate? Can he gain her trust to find out about her secret past? A tragedy all have heard of, but understand nothing about. Can the two of them come together, and will their goddess-gifted mate bond be strong enough to save her from her past? Prologue. Tears fell from Lucinda's eyes as she sat in the front room of the White Lotus pack's pack house, leaning against the far wall. She was covered in blood, twin girls between her splayed legs, only born 10 minutes ago, their umbilical cords roughly severed and knotted hastily, were lying crying on the floor. Her eyes were watching a horrific scene to be beheld inside the pack house walls: the invading Alpha Darwin, and her current Luna Felicia fighting brutally. He was trying to forcibly claim her now that he had killed her mate and their son, the future heir to the White Lotus pack. She could see the 60 women and children who had been here for safety in the pack house as the raging battle outside had begun, a battle that had turned into a full-blown SR. Alpha Darwin was on a mission for only one thing: the woman he was now fighting with to claim by force. The SR she could hear was still going on outside at this very minute, though she knew it was nearly over. This horrid Alpha was leaving no one alive, it seemed. Lucinda's mate, the future Alpha, was dead. She'd felt his bond be severed so violently that she had keeled over in pain, a scream coming from her lips, but she'd had to push it down and away. It had been only 30 minutes ago, while she had been delivering the twin girls. Both of her parents and her brother, all warrior ranked, had been killed. Each bond to them she had felt severe as well. Her whole life was falling apart here and now. Everyone she knew was dead or dying around her. She had delivered the twins, Luna Felicia's daughters. She had gone into labor from the stress of the battle outside and then the death of her mate Alpha Jude. Her Luna had shoved them into Lucinda's arms and rushed off to clean herself up and look as though she had not just given birth, a very strong woman. Protect them, Lucinda, he'll never pick them as mine if he thinks you birthed them. She had then taken a knife and sliced a wound into the inner thigh of Lucinda's left leg, not too deep as she was wolfless, smeared Lucinda's blood on the 2 baby girls to hide her scent from him and make her dress all and looking as though she had given birth without assistance. Lucinda knew the invading Alpha wouldn't give her a second look. She was wolfless, not that that had actually mattered to her mate, the future Alpha of the White Lotus pack. He'd smiled right at her when he had scented her, walked up to her and touched her face gently. Mine, he growled softly, and she had said it right back. Then he had leaned down, kissed her gently, winked right at her and sank his fangs into her neck, marking her right there in front of all her friends as they'd walked home from school. Encouraged her to mark him back right then and there too, she had. He had then proudly walked her into his father's office and stated, "Look what I found," a big BD grin on his face. This pack had several wolfless females. It was no big deal being wolfless, all of them were accepted here in the White Lotus pack. Her Luna was losing the battle before her, against the invading Alpha. Lucinda had orders to follow, and though it was breaking her heart, she knew that she had to follow through with them. "Lucinda, please," her Luna screamed at her through the mind link, begging her to help her, to complete the order. Lucinda closed her eyes, drew in a steadying breath, focused on the blade that was in her right hand hidden under the dress she was wearing, the blade was evenly weighted. She pulled herself together, focused on every ounce of training she had received, lifted the blade, opened her eyes, locked on her target and threw the blade with all the strength she had. It landed with deadly accuracy, buried deep in the Luna's back, piercing into her heart and killing her instantly. Alpha Darwin roared in anger and shock, shaking the now lifeless Luna in his arms. It seemed he didn't understand at first, then he thrust her lifeless body onto the ground and turned to the women and children in the room and yelled, "Who dares kill what is mine?" No one knew, she was under the Luna's orders to kill her. Her own Luna, mother to her own mate, had told her roughly of the history between her and the invading Alpha, that she did not want to be RD by him, or claimed by him. He had been her first mate. He had chosen her, forced her into a bond with him, and his abuse had not stopped until she had run away and turned herself rogue to escape him. She would never be his again, would rather die. Had made Lucinda promise to kill her if this was to be her fate again. She had now filled that promise, tears again were dripping down her cheeks. The Alpha glanced at her, dismissed her quickly once realizing she was wolf-less, and looked like she had just given birth and paid her the least bit of attention. When he could not get any of the women to confess to the crime and tell him which one of them had killed, what was his, and none of them could because none of them knew. They had all been focused as she was on the horrific scene before them. Alpha Darwin had been set off into a rage like nothing she had seen before. He had hacked off the Luna's hand and used it to lock down the pack house, with them all inside, and set it on fire to burn them all to death. The women and children around her were all suffering the loss of their mates, mothers, fathers, brothers and sisters, sons and daughters as she was. Only 60 of them left, and now the place is on fire around them. Lucinda got herself up off the floor, picked up the crying babies and tried to remember how to get out of the pack house. Through the haze that had become her mind, there was a passage hidden and only accessible to the Alpha family and his unit, all now dead bar herself. They were all looking at her, she was suddenly their Luna, their only hope for survival. Everything was up to her, a wolf-less 18-year-old girl who'd only been marked and mated 2 days prior to her pack. Yes, they were her pack now, she was the Luna now. She motioned for them to all follow her, and they did. They went down the hall away from where flames and smoke were billowing into the front of the pack house and was already rapidly spreading throughout the wooden structure that she had called home for the past 2 days, took them all down to the basement and into the prison cells. They were rarely used, their Alpha a fair and just man, kindly at all times, only trespassers ended up in here. The cells were dug into the stone under the pack house so they would not burn. She closed and sealed the door behind them with her handprint and had everyone move to the back, away from the door, and then they waited listening to the pack house as the walls cracked and collapsed. Here they huddled together listening until there was nothing left to be heard. She knew that they were all scared, that they all thought they were all going to die down here, suffocate and starve to death, but she knew differently. As the future Luna to this pack, this was the first thing her mate Matthew had showed her and keyed in her handprints for access to it. A way out in case the worst happened, and that day was here, today. She looked around the remnants of her pack. They were all scared, emotionally worn out and still feared for their very lives. Hours after the pack house above them stopped burning, she led them down a long secret tunnel that opened with her handprint and told them to be very quiet. The tunnel led them 1 kilometer north of the pack house. She was the only one to step out and glance around. It was eerily quiet, not even any animals about. She could not see the destruction, but could smell it, the smell of burnt wood, the smell of burnt bodies. It was all around her. The fighting and invading Alpha had come from the eastern border of the pack, so west they would go. She knew there was a neighboring pack a few hours' walk from the pack. A deadly walk through no man's land, where rogue wolves wander at will. They would have to protect themselves, Keep the children in the middle of them and pray they didn't come across any rogue packs. One here or there would likely be okay. There were 60 of them, 48 adults and 12 children, not including her and the twins, and that would deter a single rogue even if it was male and they were all female. The sun was not up yet, the sky still dark. They walked quietly, sadly away from the place they had called home, a place that had been good to live in. From high on a hill some distance away at the very edge of her pack's territory she turned and looked back. The whole place seemed to have been set on fire, not just the pack house, for there was a deep orange glow in the night sky where the center of her pack would be. They walked across rogue territory. She carried the twins the whole way, never relinquishing them to anyone who offered to carry them. They were her responsibility. She knew that they were hungry but could not do anything about it. No one could. Their angry crying had finally subsided and finally they slept. They reached the neighboring pack and she sagged down onto the ground, on her knees before their border patrol and begged for an audience with their alpha. He looked over her. She knew he could tell she was wolfless instantly. His eyes moved from her to the women and children behind her. They were covered in soot from the burning building, their faces were tear-streaked and some of them looked hollowed out and emotionless. They were all, as she was on her knees waiting for a response. It didn't take long for there to be a man and woman standing before her. She could tell it was the Alpha and his Luna. She begged for sanctuary for her women and children. He had asked who was in charge of the group and every one of her pack had pointed at her. She's our Luna. It had shocked him completely. She could see it. A wolfless Luna, not a common thing, but he could not ignore all of them. Sanctuary had been granted to them and they had all pledged loyalty and allegiance to him, his Luna and his pack. The Half Moon Pack. Lucinda's grief from all that she had lost was finally able to hit her full force and she was not able to pull herself together to look after the twins properly. She had gained an audience with her new Luna, Luna Lindy, and begged her to find a more suitable home for the twin girls as she couldn't in her grief look after them. Luna Lindy had asked her to explain fully, and so Lucinda had told her the full story about the twins' birth, who their real parents were and who she was to the girls. Luna Lindy had brought her maid into the conversation and between them, after her tale was told, they had agreed to rehome the girls. Their Gamma and his maid had only had one child and, though they wanted more, had never been able to produce any more pups. A good home, inside the pack house, safety guaranteed for her sisters and that is what they were, her mate's twin sisters, therefore her sisters. Chapter 1, 8 years after swearing allegiance to Half Moon Pack. Lucinda POV sitting quietly in their camp, waiting for the cover of darkness, with their scents masked so as not to be detected by the rogue wolves that they were getting ready to attack, would not smell them when the time came, to retrieve the 3 young she-wolves that had been kidnapped from their pack just a few days ago, while they had been shopping in the nearby human town. This was their job. They were a retrieval specialist unit. Thomas was the leader of the group, he was the current Beta's younger brother. Then there was West, Chris, Max, and Dean and Lucinda was their backup. She had worked with them for 6 years, she knew how to do her job, as did they. She never went in, wolfless and defenseless, not that she was at all defenseless. Lucinda was highly skilled in hand-to-hand combat, could throw with deadly accuracy any of the dozen blades strapped to her thighs and leather corset. Then there was the compound bow she sported, which had silver-tipped arrowheads, and she never missed her target. She had trained harder and longer than anyone in Half Moon Pack. 6 hours a day, 6 days a week, when not away on mission, for Alpha Corey and Luna Lindy. She could hold her own, each of her team members here knew that, when she had applied to join their team they'd had their reservations about her, because she was wolfless, but had quickly realized what a good asset she was to their team. She was quiet and light on her feet, didn't smell like a wolf, which sometimes meant that she could be used as bait for a trap, though Alpha Kori frowned on that deeply, so it was only allowed when absolutely necessary and her safety was guaranteed. At this moment they were all sitting around chatting quietly amongst themselves. When Lucinda turned her head at the sound of a gruff female voice, "Hello." Lucinda turned to look around her, couldn't see anyone or anything, that was very weird. A growling, chuckling sound now she heard. Frowned and was about to ask her team if they had heard anything, they should be hearing it. They were all wolves and their hearing was way more acute than hers. "I'm not out there, Lucinda, I'm in you still." Lucinda froze, her attention gained instantly. Was she going mad? What? She thought, shooting up onto her feet. "I'm your wolf, Kyra." Then a massive howl let loose inside of her mind, she shivered. It was so loud and sounded very aggressive. "Where have you been?" Lucinda had always believed she was wolfless, and at 26 why wouldn't she? "Waiting for you to be strong enough." "I'm strong, had to be. I'm stronger, faster, will be your protector now." Suddenly she could see a dark grey wolf stalking towards her in her mind, and she stalked, not walked. Her fur looked soft and silken, her eyes were glowing bright green. Lucinda could feel power pouring off of Kyra and towards her. "Will run free soon." "Full moon and I am out," she snarled, seemed angry she was trapped inside of Lucinda and unable to get out right that minute. "Okay." Lucinda had never experienced anything like this before. She felt Kyra recede into the back of her mind and settle there. It was the strangest feeling, like there was a heaviness in her mind. She could feel her, and when she reached out to try and talk to her again, she was growled at sleep now. Lucinda didn't argue, she wondered if all wolves were this aggressive towards their human counterparts. Her attention returned to the surrounding forest and her team. They were all staring at her, wide-eyed, and she noted they had backed away from her, hands all at the ready for a fight. Thomas had a hand out to the men, a gesture she recognized. It was for them to back away. "What?" she asked them, not understanding why all of a sudden they were ready to fight her. "Lucinda, did you just get your wolf?" Thomas asked, his voice was all soft and non-threatening. Lucinda frowned at him, he was talking to her in his cajoling tone, what was wrong with him? "Yes, Kyra is her name." "It's really weird." "Is it always weird?" she inquired, they all had wolves. Actually, now she realized both West and Dean's wolves were on the surface. "Oh, we saw her, heard her, Lucinda." "Did she try and take control of you right away?" "What?" "No, we just talked, I guess we introduced ourselves." "Does she seem happy to you?" "No, actually, angry at having to wait for the full moon." "Oh, I got angry, we all did." He motioned for everyone to come back and sit down again. "What happened?" she inquired, clearly she had missed something. "Oh, just the sudden appearance, your eyes glowed green and your fingers were all claws out," and she snarled quite aggressively. Lucinda looked down and glanced at her hands. There were no claws here now. "Isn't that normal?" "No." West frowned at her, "Not at all." "Oh well, she's asleep now." Lucinda shrugged. Not much she could do about it. Glancing at the time, she realized it was nearly time to go, mentioned it to them and then pulled her black hood down and her high collar up over her mouth and nose, so only her light honey brown colored eyes could be seen. Her whole outfit was black, including her compound bow and arrow quiver. All her knives were black. This way she was completely hidden in the darkness of the night, when backing them up as she would be doing tonight. They all stood, the boys wearing easily removable clothing for when they had to shift and fight in wolf form, and here in their camp was a spare bag full of clothing in case their wolves had to emerge from them without warning and tore through their clothing. She had seen all of them naked at one point or another. Though she was not interested in any of them, they were nice to look at. Her team trained a lot, they needed to, in this line of work. Stealth and agility were a must, but fighting skills needed to be top-notch, due to always having to fight it out. Sometimes it was in human form but would usually end up in wolf-on-wolf fights. She'd saved each of their butts on more than one occasion with a well-timed arrow or blade to an enemy wolf. This was her part of the job, to watch and assist from a distance, keep her eyes peeled for more enemies and deal with them as silently as was possible. Lucinda was perched above them on a hill with a clear line of sight, watching them as they descended into the small valley below. The rogues could not only be smelled from here, but could be heard. She could clearly hear them taunting the captive girls that they had chained up to a tree down there. Lucinda counted 7 female hostages, a dozen rogue wolves and 4 vehicles. They might not have a real pack, but clearly, these rogues were well organized, well funded, and had done this before. 5 highly trained stealth specialists against a dozen rogues. She didn't much like the odds, but had seen them go in like this before. Lucinda wondered where the other girls came from. It didn't really matter, just a passing thought, because they would be rescued along with their own. Alpha Corey would find out what packs they belonged to, make contact and organize for them to be picked up or transported back to their own pack. If any were rogues, they would likely have the opportunity to join the pack. She scanned the small clearing and then the woods behind it, saw movement, several people moving. Wow, her eyesight was great tonight, sharper, and the night appeared to be brighter and clearer. She could feel Kyra lift her head in her mind, enhancing her sight. She smiled. Perks of being a wolf, she guessed. She could get used to this. Her wolf snorted at her. You'd better. Focusing on the movement with her wolf's enhanced sight, she saw half a dozen men coming down the hill opposite her, heading for the valley below. Likely the collecting party for the kidnapped she-wolves. Lucinda pulled an arrow from her quiver and notched it, lined up that big, leading them down towards the valley. He was so big he had to be the leader. She'd never seen a man so big before. She watched as he settled into a hunkered position next to a tree, probably to assess the valley before going in. Even collecting parties were weary of rogues. A warning shot, she thought, pulling back the drawstring all the way. She breathed in a steadying breath, and as she breathed out let it fly, watched with a smile as it embedded into the tree just 2 inches from his face. Wood splintered off, and she knew he would have taken a few splinters to the face himself. She watched as his head snapped back, then whipped around to look where it came from. He looked right at her, she stared right back at him, still smiling under her collar. He wouldn't be able to see that though. She noticed 2 of his men abruptly peel off, one to his left, the other to his right. Good luck, boys, she thought, amused. It wasn't the first time she'd been set upon, and she had a wolf now. This could be fun, she mused to herself. Kyra snorted at her again. Her eyes moved back to that big, and watched as he took a knife from his lower leg, and sized her up with it. Oh, you want to play? Hey! She watched it come, a high-velocity throw. That big BD had some power behind him. She leaned back ever so slightly and let it sail past her and stick into the tree behind her. Lucinda pulled it out of the tree and looked back to him. He had a smirk on his face. Tut tut, she thought, as she tested the weight of the blade. Well balanced. Good, I won't have to use one of mine. Then she spun and snapped it right back at him, though she wasn't aiming to harm him, just showing him she was as good as he was, or better even. It landed exactly where she wanted it to, in the very tip of his shoe. Saw the very angry glare that came her way. her hearing now also enhanced by Kyra, picked up a soft footfall to her left. She grabbed an arrow and notched it as she turned and let fly. The minute her eyes spotted his man coming from her, it shot right into his left shoulder. He stumbled back, not liking the silver-tipped arrow and the effect it was having on him. His wolf would be out of action till it was removed. She notched a third arrow and turned toward where she now could also hear the other man coming from. Light-footed he was close enough to see the silver arrowhead aimed right at him. She saw him take a step back. Her head turned to look at that big BD on the other hill, then back to the one in front of her. It was her silent way of warning him that she was willing to shoot his man if he didn't back off. When he didn't move to leave, she let go her arrow and put it through his hand and into the tree behind him, pinning him there. Turned and notched arrow number 4, aimed it right at that big. Her warning was crystal clear. Back off now, she said softly. Relay it to him. She knew that both his men were close enough to hear her with their enhanced hearing and would do as told. Her eyesight shifted to the abrupt sound of fighting down in the valley. She didn't have any more time for this. Turned and ran off to get into a better position to start assisting her team. She let fly 3 arrows in quick succession, taking down 3 rogues, instant kills. Saw movement and that big BD and the rest of his men sprint into the valley and start taking out rogues as well. He and his men were not her problem, it seemed. Also here to take down the rogues. She had no intention of assisting him either. She just focused on her team only. She watched the fighting, and between her unit and his they made quick work of the rogues. There was a heated discussion down in the valley between Thomas and that big, who she noted the remaining girls went over to and bowed slightly to. Then moved off at his direction. He followed shortly after, finishing his conversation with Thomas. She was watching him and his team. He went right back to the tree with her arrow in it, pulled it out and scanned the area, probably looking for her. She had been on the move the whole time the fighting was happening down in the valley. He had no idea where she was, wouldn't locate her easily, she thought, chuckled to herself when he couldn't. She frowned when he snapped the arrow over his knee, and tossed it on the ground. What a waste of a perfectly good arrow. She strolled down into the valley and retrieved her arrows from the dead rogue wolves, walked into the woods and collected the tip of the broken arrow, and then returned to her team. The girls were all tired and weak, not fed properly, clearly traumatized from abuse by the rogues. Lucinda had walked among the rogues and personally made sure they were all dead. Anything still breathing, she snapped a blade into with an aggressive and deadly strike to their heart. Any wolf never went without punishment of death by her hands. She just could not stand it at all. Chapter 2. Nick POV. He halted his team as they made their way down the valley. He had not scented anything other than the rogues and their captives, 4 of whom were from his pack. But his wolf sight had just picked up movement past the treeline, on the other side of the narrow valley before them. Looked like a special unit. They were all moving in sync with each other, and he could clearly see they had a purpose. 5 to 12 not good odds. The explosion of wood right next to his face startled the life out of him. His eyes moved towards it. A long black arrow was embedded into the tree trunk right next to his face, only 2 inches away. Goddess Nick, his beta Jeremy gasped, nearly lost your head. Nick's eyes moved along the arrow to sight where it had come from, and there across the valley stood a small thin man holding a large compound bow. He was looking right back at him. Go get him. He sent down the mink link to his 2 warriors. He grabbed the knife from his leg holster and flung it with all his alpha power, aiming to put it right through that man's eye. He was more than a little shocked to see him lean back and watch it go past him. His reflexes were indeed fast. Watched as he took it from the tree, Nick couldn't help but smile at his handiwork. He watched as the other man tested the weight of his blade, then it was flung back at him. Nick knew it was going to come up short. it was too low in the air already to hit him. This man needed more training. The blade was embedded into the tip of his shoe, right between his big toe and the next one. A snarl came from Rip his wolf, angered by the second attack on him and his human counterpart. Whoever this man was going to pay. Bring that mutt to me alive. He shot to his warriors down the mind link, the two that were going to round him up. He watched as the man turned while notching an arrow and shot one of his warriors. He knew it hit him due to the cry of pain that echoed in the valley. Then he was aiming at his other warrior, hadn't let the arrow fly yet, turned and looked right at him. "Oh, I understand you, mutt, but you're mine now." He was going to have a piece of that man. When his man didn't back off, the arrow was released and he watched as his man was pinned to the tree behind him with an arrow through the hand. Then another was aimed right at him. His intent was clear. Fighting suddenly broke out in the valley. "Go," he snapped to his unit, "up on the hill would have to wait." He pulled the knife from his shoe, sheathed it and ran into the rogue camp in the valley, and he and his unit started fighting against the rogues, just as were the other team here in the valley. He took down 3 rogues on his own. He saw 3 dead with arrows each, dead center to the heart. He and his men were now standing in front of the other wolves, 5 of them all dressed in black. He snarled at them and demanded to know what pack they were from, and was informed by a man named Thomas, their leader. It was clear he was bigger and scented of beta blood. He stated, "The Half Moon Pack declared themselves as the pack's retrieval team and were here to rescue 3 wolves from their pack." The girls were now being released. His kidnapped females came over and bowed to him and thanked him for coming to get them. "Of course, girls, go with Kevin," added Brady, "you're safe now," and motioned for them to head back the way they had come. Then he turned back to Thomas. "That mutt of yours up on the hill nearly took my head off," he snapped angrily. "That is their job, as our backup. To monitor and deter, don't take it personally. You're still alive, be thankful. Our backup is not known for their mercy." His smile said it all. He was proud of his mutt, and Nick would normally have been dead. If you'd been in wolf form, it would have been a kill shot. Perhaps your mutt should know who the enemy is. Ask questions first. Shoot later. In our line of work, that's never going to happen. Thomas replied calmly, though he seemed quite amused at how ticked off Nick was. Not even bothered that he was being stared down by a massive alpha, and at 6 foot 10 inches, he knew he was imposing. "Why isn't your alpha here to do this?" he was curious about that. Retrieving stolen pack members was, as far as he was concerned, an alpha and his unit's job. "We are a specialist retrieval team, this is our job, all day, every day," he stated simply. "There shouldn't be much call for that kind of unit," he frowned. "Is your pack under threat of she-wolf kidnappings often?" "Not at all, but it does happen. We are also sent out to help other packs who are allied to us." "Your pack would be?" "Blue Moon Rising Pack." Thomas gave a low whistle. He clearly had heard of him and his pack and nodded. "Far from home, I see." "Not as the crow flies," Nick replied. "I suggest you keep your mutt on a leash." Then he strode off back up the hill. He would leave the mutt for now. He didn't need any more enemy packs. He made a point of stopping to get that arrow that had nearly taken his eye out. It was long and black with black feather ends, and the tip was silver, quite large, and had 3 barbs. He noted that once it went in, it wasn't coming out in a hurry, would require a pack doctor to remove it. Keeping a wolf at bay was its desired effect. Nick doubted very much that had been trying to take his eye out. It had been a warning shot only, he now understood, and the knife throwing just a game of "I'm better than you." He glanced around the woods and couldn't spot the stupid mutt, but took great pleasure in snapping that arrow over his knee and tossing it on the ground. "Come and get it, mutt," he thought to himself. As they headed back, his two warriors fell into step with them. "Sorry boss, she's a fiery one." "She?" "Yeah, the mutt is a girl." Now that was interesting, a girl as a backup. He wouldn't put a female wolf at risk by taking them to a rogue encampment where they took she-wolves and sold them on the black market. What a stupid idea. Another reason why he and his alpha unit dealt with this sort of thing personally: the stronger the unit, the better the odds of retrieval. Not that this was something he had to deal with often. At Blue Moon Rising Pack everybody trained, no matter their rank, no one argued with him. Not after his alpha duel, when he and Rip had displayed just how powerful they truly were. He'd had a few wolves defect to other packs after the alpha duel, but they were of no great loss to him. They had all been loyal to the previous alpha and he had been glad to see them go, tail between their legs, fearing for their very lives. "Good-sized warrior? Looks small from where I was." "No, you're right boss, tiny thing, you could probably bench press her one-armed, even if she was soaking wet." Philip informed him with a wiry smile on his face. Nick could tell Philip was impressed with her. "Maybe 5'8", lucky if she weighs 60 kilograms, boss," his other warrior, Rick, informed him. "What's the mutt look like?" he asked, curious even more now that he knew it was a girl who'd nearly taken his head off and seemed only too happy to play, who could throw better. He doubted the knife had been misthrown at all, exactly where she wanted it to go he was guessing, no wonder she'd tested the weight of it. "Don't know boss, she was all covered up, knives all over her too, at least a dozen and that bow." Philip gave a low whistle, "Nice indeed." "Her quiver held at least 24 arrows, all black. Fast and good instincts." No pack seal on outfit though." Nick noticed his top warrior, Philip, was rubbing his hand. "How bad is that wound?" "It itches, but Hinckley is on it, not impressed about the silver tip on the thing, but it went right through. I snapped it and removed it to save trying to drag it back through. Hinckley was not gonna let me anyhow." Nick turned to Rick, "How you doing?" "It's still in there, not a lethal shot. I don't think she was trying to kill me, just a warning. Pack Doc will have to remove it." "So Mac is out of action at this point?" "He'll be really cranky when he's back boss. Hurts like a BH though. I'll patch it at the cars." "You want a tranquilizer to help with the pain?" "No, it's fine. They're from the Half Moon Pack, just so you know, if you come across them later on and want a word with their mutt," he replied, knowing payback would be on Mac's list for being put out of action. "Oh hey, I know a girl who moved there, years ago, before you took over, found her mate at a mating ball there." "Goddess, do they still do that?" "Most packs do, Nick." Jeremy laughed at him. "It's the quickest way for multiple packs to find their pack members' mates. It's just a excuse in my opinion." Nick shook his head. His whole unit laughed at him, they all knew he didn't have time to hunt out a mate that might never exist. So he never held mating balls and did not attend them either. He had better things to do, like keeping his pack safe, making sure it was strong enough to defend against attacks, rogue or rival packs alike. Strong enough to go in and overtake the small packs to increase his pack territory and bring more strength to his pack. If he came across his mate, yes, he would claim her, mark and mate her and have her produce an heir, but he was in no rush and was not about to actively seek out some she-wolf who was going to sit around all day and do nothing, just need his protection because they couldn't look after themselves. He'd seen the last alpha's mate, a useless woman who spent the day ordering people to do things for her and lying around doing nothing. Nick had already made the decision that he would choose a strong female warrior from his pack when he was about 35 or so and produce an heir with them. not a Luna just and agreed upon mating to produce him an heir for the pack. A contract child, he liked to think of it. One was all he needed, any more than that, and there was a high possibility of fighting for the right to be pack alpha, and that could in turn completely ruin a pack. He should know he'd had 2 older half-brothers, both dead now. Nick didn't particularly care whether the child was male or female. As long as it was his and had his blood flowing through their veins, he knew they would be strong. He also intended to put them into training the minute the child turned 5. He would train his child himself, make sure it could fight and lead properly. Chapter 3. Lucinda POV Thomas had informed her that she had nearly shot and killed an alpha. She had simply raised an eyebrow and shrugged it off. Shouldn't have been sneaking up, you boys, was all she'd said. It didn't bother her at all, more mere amusement. He'd also told her he'd thought she was a man and had referred to her as a mutt. She didn't care he thought she was a man, but had frowned deeply at the term mutt, but considering she had clearly p'd him off, what more could she expect? A smile had played on her lips when she thought about his men informing their alpha that the so-called mutt was actually a teeny tiny girl. Near laughed out loud. It had crossed her mind briefly if they could tell she now had a wolf, or did she still appear wolf-less to everyone? Kyra was currently sleeping and had barely lifted her head during the fighting. Kyra had remained quiet and appeared to sleep in her mind right up until the night of the full moon, when she had stalked around in Lucinda's mind just waiting for the right moment. Lucinda had been sitting with Alpha Corey, Luna Lindy, and his Alpha unit and all the men from her retrieval team. They were all curious to see the very late arrival of her wolf. Kyra had ripped out of Lucinda in a fast and aggressive manner. Her first shift over in less than 2 minutes, usually took longer than that. The first time they had explained to her afterwards, it could take up to 30 minutes or more depending on rank and wolf. She had been forewarned about how it was going to be quite painful and to just try and accept it and breathe through it. Painful was an understatement. Lucinda had felt like someone had flayed her alive and broken every bone in her body at the same time. The minute Kyra was out, she'd howled up at the moon loud and impressive, and, to the alpha's surprise, many other wolves in his pack had responded to her. She had known right away they were all from the White Lotus pack. Her wolf had connected to each of them instantly. Her pack, even though long ago destroyed, the remaining members still connected to her. Everyone in the Half Moon pack was shocked by Kyra's size. She was as large as Flicker, Beta Adam's wolf. Kyra was also a growly grumpy wolf all the time, or a good 90% of the time. Just naturally grumpy, it seemed. Always flicking her tail side to side, she would snarl at any unmated male wolf that came near her with obvious intent. "Not mate" was all she would say on the subject. Lucinda had tried to explain to Kyra that their mate had died a very long time ago. 8 years in fact, but Kyra just snarled at her too. "We have a mate." Kyra, however, despite her constant grumpiness, was great on border patrols, a savage beast that took on rogue wolves with relish. She was bigger and stronger than most and knew it, was very proud of it, and let people know they couldn't lord it over her. Alpha Corey was constantly worried Kyra would get herself into a situation she couldn't get herself out of and end up severely injured or worse. Kyra just huffed in annoyance every time they were hauled into his office for him to reprimand them over Kyra's behavior. Her appearance was all dark grey, almost black, charcoal grey, Gabby had said to her, very pretty. Kyra had bright light green eyes, that attracted a lot of attention from unmated male wolves. Her coat was a little bit longer than most wolves and it was soft and silken to the touch, not rough like most. Not that many had ever touched it. Luna Lindy, Gabby and the twins, of course. Her baby sisters, 2 people that always made Kyra less grumpy. Her wolf didn't much like other wolves, tolerated them mostly, and many had learned to stay away and be respectful. The retrieval team was the exception. Kyra was never annoyed by them, they were all mated off, which helped. But even when on pack runs, Kyra would run with them and their mates. Lucinda, even now with a wolf, was still in the position of backup for the team and liked using her bow and backing them up, and Kyra didn't seem to mind it either, happy it seemed to sit back and watch Lucinda work. She liked that her human was strong and skilled. When not needed for retrieval, her whole unit was on border patrol. Lucinda always took the night shift. Kyra was actually less grumpy and growly during the night time and loved being in full control out there on the border, roaming in her wolf form for 6 hours a night. Corey didn't like his wolves patrolling to become fatigued, so they ran 4 6-hour shifts to cover the pack borders. Kyra never ran about and played or was, in any way, free-spirited it seemed, though she did often watch wolves who would run about and play with other wolves. Curious it seemed, though that too turned to annoyance after a while. "Why are they not working?" she'd asked once. Lucinda had smiled at her wolf. "They are just young ones, still in school mostly. They have a wolf, they should be working." That was her opinion on the situation, so it seemed. Currently out on the western border, patrolling the pack territory, protecting it from rogue wolves, made Kyra happy. She likes to think of herself as a protector. She found herself standing right in front of the place where Lucinda had brought the remnants of her pack and had knelt down and begged for sanctuary. She had never returned to her old pack to see the destruction that cruel, nasty Alpha had unleashed on her home. Being wolfless, she had no hope of crossing through rogue territory, it had always been a no-go zone. But with Kyra, so strong and fast and willing to destroy anything in her path, including rogues at will, no mercy granted by her wolf, they had made the trip a month after she had appeared, directly after a night patrol the day after a mating ball had been in full swing, to many wolves about, and Kyra was happy to get away from the pack for a few hours while the visiting packs were leaving. Though Kyra, it seemed, was interested in a mate. She didn't seem to push the agenda or urge Lucinda to attend mating ball to find a mate either. Lucinda wondered if that was because she herself wasn't particularly interested in finding another mate. It was hard enough finding your goddess-gifted mate, let alone being granted a second chance mate, so she didn't hold out much hope or hunt for one. If it was meant to be, he would show up at some point. She had been gifted a mate, gentle and kind, and he'd been brutally killed by a savage alpha bent on getting his chosen mate back, even though she had gone rogue, rejected him and his pack, found her fated mate and gotten to live a happy quiet life for nearly 20 years before that evil alpha had found her again. When he found her, mate and child, and tried to take her by force once again. Obviously obsessed with her. Lucinda still missed her mate Matthew. All she had left of their mate bond was the small scars that showed where his fangs had marked her. The pretty silver filigree that had once adorned her skin had burned away over a few hours after his death. Even touching the 2 small scars now she felt nothing, where once it was sensitive. Sent beautiful tingles through her body and caused goosebumps to erupt on her skin, would bring her arousal for her mate quickly to the surface and drive her insane with need when he had been teasing her, kissed her there during their mating and love-making afterwards. Those 2 days she had been marked by him had been the most exciting time for her, so filled with joy and happiness, excitement and pleasure-filled afternoons, nights and mornings. Freshly mated, they had spent a lot of time in the bedroom enjoying each other. Kyra huffed at her, she didn't have any memories of Matthew or his wolf Colton, got annoyed that Lucinda could readily bring up memories and she had no attachment to them at all. They ran now from pack territory across rogue territory at full speed. Her shift finished and the next patrol here to take over, reaching the border of the White Lotus pack in just under an hour. Kyra was fast, and this run across no man's land allowed Kyra to put all her strength and speed into use. They were home, her actual pack. They walked to where the pack house would have stood and looked around, nothing left, but they knew that it was like this the last time they'd come here. The whole place had been burnt down. Nothing was left standing. That evil man had burned absolutely everything. There wasn't so much as even a single storehouse left, just that secret passage and the cells, the way she had gotten her women and children out. The entrance to the tunnel was covered by ivy and well hidden, but she had found it and nosed her way through it, strolled down the pitch-black tunnel and found the cells still standing, made from stone. They weren't going anywhere anytime soon. It was rumored that the place was haunted by the angry spirits of the women and children that had been burned alive in the pack house. She had heard it from other visiting wolves talking about how they'd had to pass by the pack and its gates still stood, closed forever, the pack's lotus symbol still on the gate. No wolves wanted to go there, so tragic and horrific an end to a pack, was the story that everyone stayed away. Today they were headed for the front gate of her pack. It was indeed closed, chained shut at that. She had not done that, it was curious. But not of her concern. The white lotus symbol was still on the gate, as she'd heard, for passers-by to see. Kyra shifted them back to human form and Lucinda removed the symbol. It was all that was left. There literally was nothing else. She carried it back to where her pack house had used to be and just sank down on the grass. Everything was covered in grass, nature had reclaimed it all. She could look around and know where everything had been, could see it in her mind's eye, the homes, the dirt roads, the parks and gardens, the only thing still there. The natural water reserve filled with white lotus flowers. That was what the pack was named after. Off to the western edge of the pack, not a place she liked to go, fear crept into her for some reason when she went in that direction, so they just didn't do it at all. She had been born in this pack, mated to the future alpha of this pack, and was technically still the Luna, despite her alpha mate having died. Her rank still valid. Her people still bowed their heads to her when no one was around to see it. They didn't want to be disrespectful to the Alpha and Luna who took them in, but still wanted to show respect to the person who had saved their lives that horrid day. She spent a few hours just sitting within her old pack's territory, and when she felt it was time to go, shifted back to wolf form, Kyra picked up the pack symbol in her mouth and carried it. It wasn't heavy. They were summoned to his office before their patrol that night to be reprimanded for leaving pack territory and running off to her old pack. Reminded of how dangerous it was to visit the old pack, what if she ran into that alpha, what if he too had nostalgic moments and visited like she did? Seeing her there might lead him to believe not everyone was dead. That some people had escaped, just like they actually had. That could bring him here to this pack in search of those who'd escaped his SR, and, if that happened, what if he scented out the twins, decided he wanted them for himself and tried to take them as a replacement for their mother? Lucinda did see the logic of it, but didn't see why she couldn't. It had been 8 long years, it was unlikely that the man was still the alpha of a pack. He'd been older then and would be even older now. Surely he'd passed on the throne to an heir who wouldn't be obsessed with a dead burnt-down piece of land. Punishment was having to train the juniors, every day for a week, one day, for every hour she had foolishly been gone. A 2-hour training session with 14 to 16-year-old teenagers. She could already feel Kyra's annoyance. It was her alpha's way to punish both of them. He knew Kyra hated horny teenagers the most, worse than unmated males. They had no wolves, and so she couldn't dish out punishment to those stupid enough to think it was okay to tease or make lewd comments. They just had to put up with it, and getting up that early after night patrol meant lack of sleep as well, not to mention no training for themselves every day. That was Lucinda's punishment. Chapter 4. Nick POV Jeremy, his beta, had dropped an envelope on the desk in front of him. He was smiling that stupid grin he got when there was something mischievous about to happen. Nick raised an eyebrow at his beta, whose grin just got bigger, and he just stood there staring at him. It seriously couldn't be that funny. Though Jeremy thought lots of things were funny nowadays. The man was 6'4" with dark brown eyes, short light brown hair and dimple in his chin, and one deep dimple in his right cheek which was showing with his clear amusement over whatever he thought was funny. The man took great pleasure and delight in ribbing him about that who he'd had a showdown with a few months ago, just wouldn't let it go, because according to him and Brady, he, their alpha, had lost to a girl, a teensy-weensy little girl as they like to phrase it. He occasionally would find a black arrow stuck in his chair, or a knife in a shoe of his. They thought they were being funny. And no amount of punishment he dished out stopped it. Troublemakers, both of them. Brady feeding off of Jeremy's desire to annoy and play practical jokes, the two of them troublesome, but also his closest friends. Nick, however, did not see it that way. His showdown with the mutt had been interrupted, and so, therefore, no one had won it, according to his recollection. He was actually itching for a rematch. Her skill, he had to admit, was a little impressive, but he was willing to bet if he stood next to her on the training ground his knife-throwing skills would surpass hers with ease. His wolf Rip just wanted a chance to use his alpha aura to put her in her place and show her who was boss. Though it was unlikely they would ever get the chance, Half Moon Pack was in no way affiliated with his pack, and it was a good 5-hour drive away by car. There was also nothing but rogue territory between his and theirs, and the terrain was pretty rough going, with wetlands dotted along the way and abandoned long-dead pack territory as well. Sad story, he'd heard it, everyone had. But it was before his time. 3 years before he took over, in fact. No one had gone to their aid, very sad. Nick turned his attention to the envelope Jeremy had dropped on his desk, the very thing his beta was finding highly amusing. It was a soft metallic green envelope with a moon seal on the back, which indicated it was a mating ball invitation. He sighed and tossed it into the bin next to his desk. Why Jeremy would find that amusing he had no idea. He knew Nick would not attend it, wouldn't even open the envelope for that matter. Why is that so amusing to you? He asked, already turning back to the budget he had been working on for the new school he was having built. To his complete surprise, Jeremy retrieved it from the bin and put it back in front of him again. Are you trying to test my patience today, Beta? Nick used his rank instead of his name, allowing Jeremy, who he'd known since he was 6 years old, to show his annoyance and displeasure at his actions. Read it. Jeremy stated, amusement still with him. Nick sighed. I don't have to, it's a mating ball invitation, I can tell from the full moon seal on the back. Indeed it is, his friend chuckled. Why? Jeremy, do you find this outdated thing so amusing? You know I am not going to attend, I'm not even going to reply. He moved to toss it in the bin again. Jeremy's hand stopped him. Oh come on Nick, just this once, open it, read it, humor me just this once. No. Nick snapped and was about to tear the envelope in half to make his point and show his displeasure with his beta, but to his complete disbelief, Jeremy snatched it from his hands before he could, used his wolf's speed to grab it. You have a death wish today, he snarled. Jeremy just laughed at him. Maybe, just maybe today I do. He then walked around Nick's desk and sat himself down in one of the chairs in front of his desk, tore the full moon seal off and opened the letter. For the love of the goddess, Nick muttered to himself. Yes. Jeremy grinned again. The goddess herself requests that you, Alpha Nicholas of Blue Moon Rising Pack, attend one of her mating balls. He laughed and then proceeded to read the invitation out loud. Nick leaned back in his chair and watched him. It was the same every time: bring your unmated wolves, male and female, for a chance to see if they can find their fated mates upon the next full moon. He was apparently allowed to bring 20 wolves. It also indicated that 6 other packs were invited, so a total of 140 unmated wolves would be visiting, and there would also be wolves from the pack holding the mating ball. It was the only information Jeremy hadn't parted with, which was curious. After a full minute of silence and the two of them just staring at each other, Nick nearly yelled at him, "Well, you made me listen to that dribble. Who sent the stupid thing?" Jeremy's grin was back in full force, only now there was a mischievous glint in his eye as well. "Thought you didn't care." "For goddess's sake, Jeremy," he was starting to lose his patience. "Half Moon Pack, Nick." Oh, now he knew why Jeremy found it so amusing to himself. That was the Mutts Pack. Hang on, how'd he know that, without opening it first? Nick held out his hand, a frown on his face. He hadn't seen a pack symbol on the thing when he'd glanced at it. "You're not going to rip it up now, are you?" "Just give it over," he snapped, annoyed with his beta. "You're tiresome. Do you know that?" "Yes, boss, I do know that." Jeremy was still grinning and there was full amusement in his voice. He sat there tapping the envelope in his hand. "I think you will destroy it," he suddenly said, and pocketed the invite in his shirt pocket, then stood and headed out of the room with it. Rip let out a warning growl, not liking being dismissed by his own beta. Jeremy stopped at the door, turned and looked right at him. That blasted mischievous glint back in his eye. "I thought you didn't care about mating balls, Nick." Then he closed the door behind him. Nick's wolf hearing picked up his beta's footsteps. They were running away from his office. He knew better, but it seemed that today Jeremy did indeed have a death wish. Nick gave him a 10 count and then got up from his desk, walked across his office and opened the door, cracked his neck, rolled his shoulders and smiled. "Let's go get him," he said to Rip, and they were off after him. He shot out of the pack house using Rip's wolf speed, passing by Brady, who was laughing. He was just outside the pack house's front door. Jeremy, he could see, was off and running towards the training grounds at full wolf speed too. Nick could hear the man laughing as he ran away. "He can't outrun us." Rip snorted, amused at the thought that his beta was trying to get away from him. "No, he can't." Nick agreed. The chase was on. Jeremy used the training ground obstacles to help delay his capture, but it was still all of only a few minutes before he was crash-tackled to the ground and pinned down. Nick flipped his beta over, who'd stopped fighting him. Now he was captured, and reached into that pocket for the invite. Jeremy, however, was still laughing hysterically almost. His amusement was even more so now than before. Nick came up empty-handed. Pat his beta down and checked all of his pockets. There was no envelope. He'd palmed it off to someone. "You." Nick got up, thinking about who he'd passed. Brady had been laughing outside the front of the pack house. He put a boot into Jeremy's ribs just hard enough to make him say "Ouch, you'll keep," he muttered. "Oh Brady, where are you?" he asked through a mink link, his voice full, soft and deadly. "I don't know, boss." "Never been in this part of the pack before." Clear amusement flowed down the link towards him, then Brady severed the link. "Right, the boys wanted to play, it seemed. Rip, go get him." Nick smiled to himself. No one in this pack could hide from his wolf. It was a hunt, so it seemed. Rip was on it fast. He loved a good hunt, straight back to the pack house, to pick up the scent of the last place they'd seen him. Rip knew the scent of his delta, and tracked him, moving quickly through the pack house and out through the dining room, out the back door and off into the woods heading north. The mission: hunt and capture. It took 7 minutes till his Delta was pinned down on the ground beneath him by the North Lake. He was laughing so hard he could barely lay still. Nick again came up empty-handed, nothing in Brady's pockets either. "Where is it?" "I have no idea what you are talking about," he laughed, claiming no knowledge of what he was being hunted for. "Who'd you give it to?" "Give what to, boss?" "Jeremy just linked me to run and play along, you know me, I can't resist, boss." Nick grit his teeth, clearly Jeremy's game was still afoot. "Oh Jeremy," he shot down the link to his beta. "Yes Nick," he answered all proper like, beta respect showing. "Where is it?" "What would you be referring to now?" he feigned innocence. "You know what? You sleepwalking again, boss, having weird dreams again maybe," the amusement in his voice. He was unable to disguise. The game he had set up was clearly not close to being over yet. Boys had nothing to do, it seemed, well they would have when he was done with them. As he walked back towards the pack house he could only think of one way to end this quickly. "Oh Jeremy," Brady was trailing him, still amused. "It wouldn't be for long, punishment would be dealt out." "Yes boss, that pretty redhead you like, tell her I want a dinner date with her." His voice had dropped to a soft husky note, so his beta fully understood his intentions. "7 p.m. suits me, you wouldn't?" "Oh wouldn't I?" Nick was the one smiling now, he was unmated and enjoyed the company of a she-wolf. Jeremy's latest fling was quite pretty, and he would know, no she-wolf turned down the chance to climb into the alpha's bed. "You're no fun." Jeremy huffed down the link. "It's in your office, boss." "It had better be, or your redhead will be in my bed tonight. Game over." Even Rip liked the way he had ended it. He walked into his office to find Kevin his gamma sitting on the comfortable couch, smiling up at him, and in his hand was the invite. Jeremy was leaning on the side of his desk, still smiling at the game he had set up. Nick held out his hand. "How'd you get that?" "Jeremy gave it to me as he came out of your office." He shrugged, but was smiling just as much as the other two were. "Link me to wait in the office with it once you came after him." He took the envelope which contained the invite and stared at Jeremy. "What boss, what you were looking for was right in your office the whole time." Nick glowered at him, turned the envelope over, to try and figure out how he knew where it had come from without opening it. There were no pack markings on it to indicate the sending pack. "How'd you know where it came from?" "I asked the courier who delivered it." "What? It was hand-delivered?" "That was odd." "Yep, and had to be signed for by a ranked member of the pack, so I went, I was down that way." He shrugged. Nick was staring at the actual invite now itself. He could smell a female scent on it, the sending pack's Luna he presumed. "They don't normally need to be signed for, right?" "Correct." Jeremy nodded, but that stupid grin was back on his face again. "What now, Jeremy?" "Nick, I didn't see anywhere on that invite for you to indicate your reply." "No they wouldn't," he snapped, reading the invite for himself, looking for the RSVP section, there wasn't one. "Yes, I think they would." Kevin smiled from across the room, joining in on the conversation. "I read it several times. Signing for it is an agreement that you'll attend the ball. Are they so desperate to mate off their wolves, that they have to use this archaic tradition?" he muttered, his hand had now been forced. His beta's signature was as good as his on a matter like this. Jeremy's game had started the minute that courier had shown him the blasted envelope. He thought it would be fun to make his alpha go to a mating ball. Well, he would be punished, that was for sure. His mind was clearly twisted. Turning to look at the date and then, when the next full moon was, just 9 days away. He frowned, short notice, and he knew that he would be expected the day before. He might not do these things, but the former alpha had, and so had his father. He knew how they worked. You had to arrive the day before to give all the arriving packs time to settle in and mingle first. Brady, you will be in charge of selecting the 20 wolves for this thing. What? No, that's a nightmare of a job, they will all want to go. Yes, for your part in this little joke, you get to deal with all the wolves begging and crying to go, then angry they didn't get selected. He watched very satisfied as Brady glared at Jeremy, whose actual fault it was, but if you want to play you might just get burned. Jeremy, you will be going with me to this stupid thing. And as punishment for actually having the hide to sign for it, you get to do crush duties for the next 5 days. What? His beta practically yelled in outrage. Nick was very satisfied with Jeremy's response. He wouldn't be so bored now. The next 5 days was going to be keeping his beta very busy. The pack crush house just over 40 rambunctious toddlers and screaming pups. It would be so very loud and annoying, just the thing to remind him not to do it again. Rip snorted at him. He had actually enjoyed the hunt around the pack. It wasn't often they just let loose like that. Nick now could see the fun of it too. But punishment was fun to dish out. He was going to enjoy strolling by the crush on a daily basis and watching Jeremy suffer for his foolish game. He could also play, just didn't do it often. Was the alpha and had to be seen as the authority, not a joker. To be in control at all times, he had to command respect and wield it. Chapter 5. Lucinda POV. Arriving back onto pack territory was a good feeling. The retrieval team had been away nearly a week, tracking and retrieving a wayward runaway, an alpha's daughter no less, rebellious thing at just 13, already as defiant as a fully grown alpha she-wolf would be, and didn't even have her wolf yet. She had been a handful to say the least. Sneaky little thing was clearly used to slipping past her father's warriors. Had managed to slip her team twice, once in custody. Run away over a boy of all things. Typical teenager thought she would be safe in the human world, masking her scent, but had run out of it and they had been on her quite quickly then. Safely returned to her family and her father agreed she could date the boy to placate her and keep her home. It was almost 5 p.m., the evening setting in. She already knew there was a mating ball tomorrow night. Thankfully she would be on border patrol like always. Lucinda was still kitted out in her retrieval gear, even her bow was still on her back, its case's lock busted, that little brat had broken it. Thomas had taken it to his friend Manny, who was the pack's weapons specialist. He'd fix it and drop it off at some point tomorrow for her. Lucinda could see that just past her house her twin sisters were playing, in the playground that sat between her house and the pack house. Those two girls knew better than to be out without Gabby when there were other packs visiting. She frowned and walked right past her house to the playground, hopped over the fence, one hand on it for leverage. "What are you two doing?" she growled at them playfully. They both turned and looked at her, squealed in delight and run right over to her. They were small for 8, maybe looked 6 if they were lucky. Luna Lindy said it was because they had been born prematurely. Lucinda snagged an arm around each one's waist and tipped them upside down, then spun them around till they were laughing so hard they were crying out they were going to pee themselves. She put them down. "Come on you two, you know better than to be out here on your own, yes." "Yes," they both pouted up at her with their big blue eyes. Batted their very long lashes at her, like they would for Gabby or James to get away with naughty things. "Oh, that doesn't work on me." Lucinda said let's go home, and then she chased them out of the playground and down the side of the pack house. In through the Omega's door and up the stairs to the first floor, right to the Luna's office. She followed them with Kyra making little playful growls and snorts at them, making them laugh and scream all the way there. Lucinda followed them right into Luna Lindy's office, saw Gabby and Lindy both there. "Did you lose a couple of things?" she asked, referring to the twins now climbing into Gabby's lap for protection from their big sister. "They were with the nanny." Gabby frowned at them. Both girls giggled and battered their lashes up at their mummy. She melted. Lucinda could not have asked for a better mother to them. Gabby loved them as if she had birthed them herself. They owned the woman's heart, that was for certain. They were out in the playground unattended. She frowned at them. "Not something they should do with other packs here, "No, Lucy," they answered, all sad-like, "but we're faking it completely." Lucinda smiled behind her mask and shook her head. Only they would call her that. No one else did. It had started when they were little and unable to say her full name, and it had stuck. She didn't mind at all. Her mum and dad had used to call her Lucy all the time. "I'll you next time," she told them firmly. That made their little mouths open in big O's. She sounded like she meant it but really didn't mean it. She nodded to the Luna. "I should go nap. I have patrol duty tonight." "Thank you for returning them." Gabby nodded to her. "No problem, girls, I'll see you at training tomorrow," and then she was gone. Lucinda woke half an hour earlier than needed to. Her wolf's hearing could already hear wolves mating. With so many wolves on pack territory, it was bound to happen. They wouldn't find their mates until the full moon rose tomorrow, but that never stopped the horny beasts from finding someone to have S*X with tonight. It might be their last night for a fling. She knew some wolves liked to wait to find their goddess-gifted mates, but others didn't care at all. Those were the ones she could hear now. Night patrol started at midnight, and for Kyra it was only a 30 minutes trot or 13 min fully fledged flat-out run to get there. She only ever patrolled the eastern border. It was harder over here, saw more action on a regular basis, due to the massive amount of rogue territory between this pack and the next one. Kyra loved a good fight. Anything that came into sight was fair game. Even if it was strolling on by too close to the border, she would be off to hunt it down. With all the mating going on, there would likely be extra rogue activity tonight and tomorrow. The rogues would be able to smell the arousal of all the wolves and be driven to try and get some for themselves. Likely patrols all the way round the pack would see rogues tonight. She and Kyra were on alert to assist all other boarders tonight and be patrolling with another wolf in case she was called away to a different zone to help out. Food in her belly and a large coffee drank, she opened her front door and stepped out, closed it and shifted into Kyra, headed for her border to protect as always, in wolf form ready for action. They passed several couples having S*X right out in the open, up against trees, on the ground, bent over a boulder, not caring really who saw them. Kyra snorted her disgust at them not mates. It was clear right from the beginning Kyra would not be interested in any wolf other than her mate. She certainly wasn't going to allow Lucinda to run around and do as she pleased in that department, not that Lucinda would. She had only ever been with Matthew, her mate, and he was gone now. Second chance mates didn't come along all that often. She was also not looking for another mate. Stayed away from the full moon mating balls. That was not a guarantee she wouldn't be scented out if someone was her second chance mate, but it did limit it quite bit. Kyra also never really took interest in mating balls either. Too much noise, too many unmated males that would take one look at her and want to have S*X with her. She was a beautiful wolf. Lucinda had been propositioned many times herself, which lead her to believe she must be somewhat attractive. She had waist-length black hair, milky white skin. No matter how much time she spent in the sun, she just didn't tan. Her body, though small, was athletic. She had curves, quite ample breasts and a round bottom from all her lunges and squats. She had large golden brown honey-colored eyes which did seem to attract males, probably due to the thick long black lashes that went with them. She had a heart-shaped face and full lips that she had been told were wasted, because she wouldn't let anyone kiss them. That guy had be punched in the gut for trying to, even after she'd told him to back off. Though her personality was generally a happy demeanor, she was easily annoyed, and if Kyra was in a foul mood, it could filter to Lucinda and put her in a bad mood too. Her wolf's emotions could influence her own, though cheering Kyra up was relatively easy, as easy as spending time with the little ones. It seemed her wolf loved babies and toddlers. Happy to sit and watch them all day. Babies, Lucinda had left that one alone. The only other thing she liked was running, hunting, and training. Kyra didn't much like sitting around doing nothing, and a bored Kyra could be a destructive Kyra. Therefore they trained 6 days a week and working 6 nights on border patrol when here in the pack, only taking 1 day off, as this was all her wolf could handle without becoming agitated and growly. The night was eventful on border patrol. Kyra got 3 rogue kills, in on the eastern border along with her wolf partner, and had raced across the pack to help out on the western border. Just before sunrise, as there was a group of 15 rogues setting up for attack, Kyra had launched herself into the middle of the fighting to lend an assist to her fellow wolves. Not much caring about anything, she had ripped rogues off her other patrol wolves, slammed them down on the ground and ripped throats out. She slashed with her claws, ripped with her jaw, showing no mercy at all. She had given no quarter. There had been an alpha wolf amongst the battle going on. She had seen it, stood a good head and shoulder above her wolf. It was massive. Shocked her a little, to be honest, as he wasn't her alpha and was out assisting patrol. A little odd. Not to mention they'd never seen a wolf so large before. Kyra was a large wolf, stood taller than all the wolves in the pack bar the alpha and beta's wolves that was. Kyra had turned and looked right at the giant black wolf. When the battle had been over, "Not one of ours, definitely an alpha," Lucinda had commented. Just by the sheer size of him, that wolf had stood right up and watched her. Kyra had bared her teeth to him, showing her displeasure at his attention. Then Kyra had simply turned and walked away from him in wolf form. This was just going to be the beginning. Tonight would be even worse though, she thought as the sun rose and she headed home. Strolled through the edge of the forest past the back of the pack house, still in wolf form, heard several unmated wolves call to her. She simply growled at them menacingly and moved on without stopping. They did not interest her in the slightest. Made their way around the pack house, past the playground and to her front door, where she shifted. Lucinda stopped and turned to look around her. She could feel eyes on her. She knew she was completely naked, but that was nothing to be ashamed of. Everybody saw everyone naked at some point, after shifts for pack runs, after fighting rogue attacks, after the first shift. There were many reasons why wolves ripped out of their human counterparts. Her eyes landed on 2 men over by some of the visiting pack cars. She wasn't facing them directly, only side on, but they were clearly watching her. She rolled her eyes. That big BD of an alpha and his beta. Kyra had likely caught their attention, even from way over here on the other side of the pack house. They were a good 150 meters away, but Kyra's size and beauty drew everyone's attention. Lucinda turned away from them the moment she realized that was the alpha who liked to call her a mutt. Just yesterday when she had come home she'd heard it with her wolf hearing. "Hey Nick, look over there." The mutt, he muttered once he'd looked to where she was, easily recognizable to him as she'd been kicked out still. She and Kyra had completely ignored him. Their only thought had been the twins and to get them inside away from non-pack members at the time, so they had left it alone. If the twins hadn't been there she'd likely have shot an arrow at him for his disrespectful comment, or let Kyra have a go at him herself. Kyra was completely offended by the term mutt. "That's the alpha wolf, fighting rogues with us," Kyra huffed. "Smells the same." The wind was blowing in their direction and she could scent him easily from here. Right now the man was staring at her, not knowing she was the so-called mutt. What a DK! She showered and ate breakfast, and hit the hay. They had training with the twins this afternoon and then had patrol again tonight. Chapter 6. Nick POV. The 5-hour drive to Half Moon Pack was too long, and put him in a bad mood. His 6'10" frame never really fit into any vehicle comfortably, he always felt cramped. Even in his personal Hummer he still felt cramped. They were arriving in a 6-car convoy, leaving room to bring extra wolves home with him. Brady had selected 10 males and 10 females to come, tried to make it fair as possibly some were mid-20s and others younger. He'd spent the last 7 days being hounded by the unmated wolves in the pack. Seeing as this was the first time they were allowed to attend a mating ball in the 5 years, since Nick had taken over. Nick hadn't been able to believe all the excitement throughout his pack while Brady was trying to sort out who was going. He'd never actually seen anything like it. Perhaps he was not being the best alpha, keeping them from mating balls. We'd see how this one went and make a decision on it afterwards. He and Jeremy were the only ones in his car. It was all black just like his wolf, and the number plate blue MR1. So everyone would know it was the Alpha's vehicle. Alpha Corey and Luna Lindy were waiting for him on the pack house steps. It was a nice clean-looking building painted in a light green, same as the envelope he realized. Had a waist-high hedge all the way along it and what appeared to be a fully covered wrap-around veranda. Cute, he thought. Could that be the Luna's influence? Odd. The building itself stood 3 stories high, but was a good 100 meters long. About half the size of his pack house, but then his pack was nearly 2,000 strong and this one was only 800 or so. Nick introduced himself, his beta and his 20 unmated wolves, polite formalities. He'd seen the way Luna Lindy's mouth had twitched up in the left corner, in what he could only describe as amusement. He recalled her scent from the invitation, so this was the Luna that thought she could force his hand to be here. She was a short woman not past 5'2", was sporting a blonde pixie cut that suited her quite well. She had light green eyes, very pale. He'd never seen that shade before, nearly white almost but definitely green, and her rather plump lips were showing her amusement at his having to be here. She was very tiny, but pretty. Her arm was casually looped through her mate's. She was very secure in her position, he could tell. How she could hold an air of authority was beyond him. Every pack around would know he did not attend these things and she probably felt somewhat superior for getting him here. Well, it would be the last time someone tricked him into a mating ball. They had been shown to their accommodations. He and Jeremy had rooms on the first floor of the pack house. Been told the western side of the first floor was for guests, the eastern side held the Luna's office and the pack library and a conference room for alpha meetings. A Luna having an office? He shook his head, why he couldn't fathom. The alpha's office, he noted, was on the ground floor directly across from the pack house front doors, same place as his. Nick liked being able to access the front door quickly if there was an attack, so it was the best place for it, or so he liked to think. His unmated wolves were seen to a long building off the western side of the pack house, kind of like university dorm-style rooms, but it was just for 2 days. His wolves would survive the accommodations. They all had reversed cycle air conditioning, a large bed, small wardrobe, and an ensuite bathroom. The room also contained a min-bar fridge with snacks and drinks in them, though no alcohol, his wolves noted. He'd been outside with Jeremy getting his luggage from his vehicle when Jeremy had cleared his throat, nudged him and said, "Hey Nick, look over there." Nick was still feeling annoyed from his drive here and the way the Luna had looked at him, but he had moved his eyes off in the direction Jeremy was indicating, and lo and behold, there she was, the mutt he had murmured he'd come here get a rematch from, was walking towards a playground. He'd been about to head off after her when he realized she was heading right toward the girls playing in the playground, twins he noted. She was still fully kitted out, black combat boots, black tights, knives strapped to each thigh. She was wearing a black leather under-bust corset with more knives slotted into it, a black skin-tight long-sleeve top. Nice-sized beasts, probably fit in his hands nicely. A smile touched his lips at the thought they were pushed up quite perkily by that corset. Her hood was down and the high collar of her shirt was up, the only parts of her visible her eyes and her hands, though he couldn't see what color her eyes were from here. She was not facing him. Her bow and quiver were strapped to her back. A very athletic creature, he watched as she vaulted one-handed over the 1-meter-high fence around the playground. The bow and quiver didn't hinder her at all, probably trained with it on. Then was all over the twin girls in the playground. His first instinct had to be stalk over there and tear strips off of the she-wolf for their last encounter, but the way she had beelined those children in the park had stopped him. From what he was watching, she was likely their mother. The way he'd heard her chastise them and watched her play with them, it was likely he'd have to get her alone. She moved off down the side of the pack house, probably lived in it from the way she strolled in that direction with the children. He wondered if she was a ranked member of the pack that could make things more difficult. He'd headed off inside hoping to catch a glimpse of what she actually looked like, but he didn't see her. Wherever they had gone, it had not been to the front of the pack house. He would never allow any of his pack members to stroll through the pack or into his pack house dressed like that, or kitted out in a fully weaponized manner as was her retrieval gear. But he guessed not his pack, different set of rules. A tad disrespectful, he thought, to the alpha of the pack. He was standing thinking about how she had strolled right into the pack house like that, the comments from that day, how proud that Beta had seemed. Perhaps she was his mate. Perhaps that was why she was allowed to stroll around as she does. Though he wouldn't allow Jeremy's mate to do that, when he found his mate that was seeing the she-wolf in the light of day, his men weren't wrong. She was indeed a tiny she-wolf. Their estimate of her height was off though. Those boots of hers added a good 2 inches of height to her small frame. Couldn't be more than 5'6". He was going to tower over the top of her when they came face to face. She would fear him instantly. He smiled to himself. He was 6'10" and muscled to the hilt, his shoulders so wide he only just fit through a standard-sized doorway. Nick worked out a lot and aimed to look imposing and threatening, even when he was just standing around doing nothing. His black hair was a little on the long side but easily swept back with some hair gel, as it was now. All the she-wolves walking past him were smiling and batting their lashes at him. He knew he was considered devilishly handsome, with his straight nose, square jawline and apparently kissable lips. Not too thin, not too fat, one she-wolf had told him, and she'd spent most of her time kissing him, when they'd spent the night together. He also boasted unnaturally long black eyelashes that she-wolves died for. Clean-shaven or unshaven unmated she-wolves flocked to him. His bed was only empty if he wanted it to be. He was very careful to make sure that no pups had been created between him and his mile-long list of lovers. His lovers were under no illusion that he was after anything more than a good hard. He also made sure they were gone the minute he was done with them. No she-wolf ever spent the night in the Alpha Suite. He didn't need nor want them getting any ideas. He was not looking to mark them or make them his Luna. None of them had actually been in the Alpha Suite. He used the empty room across the hall for S*X, and that was how it would stay. Even when he got round to picking the warrior to have his heir, the child would not be conceived as his suite. His child would though stay in the Alpha Suite. The suite housed 4 bedrooms other than his. His father had multiple children with multiple women, therefore needed the rooms. His child's mother could have a room down the hall if he couldn't convince her to give it up. Which he was hoping to do. What he really wanted was just a surrogate to birth him an heir. That child would also not see a string of she-wolves coming and going from his bed. He'd seen that as a child and had hated it every single time, saw the hurt in his mother's eyes every time too. He would not do that to his child. Several mark had been set up in a long line behind the pack house to house all the visiting wolves to eat meals in. He knew 3 of the visiting alphas and they were very shocked to see him here at the mating ball. He had just shrugged it off and said it was about time, that he was doing it for his pack members. He did not admit to being tricked into it. His alpha-enhanced senses were already smelling arousal from all the unmated wolves and several had peeled off to have some fun. He'd had words with his unmated wolves about the etiquette he expected them to display. There would be no frivolous S**X prior to the ball. He expected them all to wait until the mating ball. If they did not find their mate, then they could find an unmated partner to enjoy time with for the last night, but tonight it was expected that they all behave themselves and show pride for their pack. He himself was constantly bumped into by unmated she-wolves, and a very flirty "oh I'm sorry" had followed along with a hand that lingered somewhere on his body, usually his abdomen, and dinner hadn't even started yet. This was just pre-dinner drinks. He'd had 4 fully loaded wolfen drinks already, hated these blasted balls, and the way she-wolves fell all over him and the constant smell of arousal and S**X of other wolves drove him mad, not to mention that his alpha hearing picked up nearly everything as well. Even Rip was annoyed right now. He found Jeremy sitting at their table with a red-haired she-wolf in his lap. Clearly he was not going along with the rules that his alpha had laid out. The man was obsessed with red-headed women. When he found his mate, if she wasn't a redhead, she might have trouble getting him to mark and mate her. Nick had not seen a single she-wolf come out of his beta's suite in the last 4 years that was not a redhead. Apparently it was his favorite color. This particular she-wolf was sitting very close to him and he could smell her, and she looked hot and bothered, for although they were sitting here in a very public place, Jeremy's hand was under the girl's skirt. Nick kicked the back of his chair, and heard the girl suddenly gasp out loud, then a hand clamped over her mouth. "Oh, for the love of the goddess!" Nick shot at Jeremy through the mind link. "Get your hand out of there!" "Rules!" he snapped angrily. The rest of his pack seemed to be obeying, but not Jeremy, just had to push his buttons. "That was your fault!" Jeremy shot back. "Startled me and my fingers slipped." He removed his hand and turned to look at Nick, a smirk on his face as he tasted his finger. Nick was ready to kill him. "Take that to your room," he snarled at his beta. Jeremy smiled and stood grabbing the girl's hand. "If you insist, boss," and walked away, taking her with him. Nothing changes with that man. This was exactly why he hated these things. Wolves were here to see if they could find their fated mates when the full moon rose tomorrow. Yet they were all off getting what they could from strangers, when it was highly possible that they would meet their mate in just over 24 hours. This was the one place and time he would not indulge in S**X, not that he expecting to find his mate. But if he did, he didn't want her to smell another woman on him, or have seen him go off to someone the day before her met her. That is just wrong. This was the one time he hated his alpha senses and how heightened they just were. Getting any sleep tonight or tomorrow wasn't likely going to happen. He'd probably just roam about and look around the pack, well away from the pack house. He was on his 6th drink when he spotted the twin girls from earlier in the evening. They were running and screaming across the grassed area, with what he could only imagine was their nanny in hot pursuit. She looked flushed and exhausted. Her dark hair was a mess and she was covered in, from what his sense of smell could pick up, chocolate sauce. His mouth twitched. They were obviously a handful. He tracked them across the area behind the pack house to a short, dark-haired woman. She had an athletic build, she fit the description. He drained his glass, banged it down on the table and stalked over to her. Stepped right up to her, towering over her in fact, and stood glaring down at her. Her grey eyes widened at his sudden appearance in front of her. She took a step back, pushed the twins behind her. He took a step forward. He'd drank enough wolfen scotch to have it affect his judgment. His wolf Rip had told him not now, but Nick had waited long enough to have this little wolf apologize for her actions. And apparently she had been out here the whole time ignoring him. She had to know who he was the biggest wolf here. And surely Thomas would have mentioned him to her. Yet she was over there without a care in the world, seemingly didn't think she owed him an apology. Well, she did. Nick could smell fear coming from her. He was close enough not to need Rip's help on that. Good, he wanted her to be afraid. Apologize, he snapped at her angrily, as he recalled the arrow 2 inches from his face, the knife in his boot. Then all of a sudden he was set upon by 4 wolves and dragged away from the woman. Alpha Corey was standing directly before him, his wolf right there on the surface snarling aggressively at him, as was his beta, and the delta. The gamma was now standing with his arms around the small frightened woman. All their wolves were out ready to take him on. What do you think you are doing? Alpha Corey demanded, his wolf talking with him, backing him up the whole way. Getting my apology from that mutt, who shot arrows at me and my men, he shot back. Who are you calling a mutt? The gamma yelled at him, stepping forward to size him up. He has some guts, Nick thought. Apologize to my mate this instance or you and I are going to go toe to toe. Not till she does first. Nick replied, he would get his apology. Wait, Alpha Nicholas, what are you referring to exactly? Why does Gabby need to apologize to you? Perhaps there has been a misunderstanding here. She's the retrieval backup girl, right? I saw those twins with her earlier, when she came back. She owes me an apology. Wrong freaking wolf, the gamma roared at him. Clearly he was severely peed off. Maybe he had a right to be, Nick was now thinking. Perhaps drinking hadn't been the best idea. Nick was frowning, looked at the she-wolf trying to make an assessment of her from what he'd seen earlier this evening. Alpha Corey sighed and interrupted his thoughts. Alpha Nicholas, you are mistaken, this is my gamma's mate Gabby, and the wolf you would be looking for would be Lucinda White, and I advise you do apologize right now. I and my wolf will not tolerate disrespect like that here. Nick's frown deepened. He did not like having to apologize for anything. He was an alpha and it shouldn't be necessary. But by the looks of it, he had just scared out of an innocent woman with her twins directly behind her. He'd royally screwed this up. No more drinking this trip. My apologies, he said gruffly. I was mistaken. He then turned and strode away, annoyed with himself for making an ass of himself. He should have confirmed who she was first. Wasn't going to be able to make an alliance with this pack at this rate. So who was this Lucinda she-wolf? He was standing well away from the pack house, ticked off at himself for not doing his due diligence and making sure he had the right she-wolf. Something he would normally do. But he guessed 6 Wolfen strength glasses of scotch was enough for him to forget his due diligence. Perhaps this Lucinda she-wolf was related to the Gammas, otherwise how could she be so close to the twins? They had run over to her right away, nil hesitation, like she was their mother, and she had clearly chastised them as a parent would. Things were weird here, he thought to himself. He stayed out there until his head cleared and he felt more himself. Then, taking a deep breath, Nick headed back out to the tented area and walked over to Alpha Corey's table, looked directly at the Gamma's mate. I'm truly sorry, I honestly thought you were the she-wolf I was looking for. I did not mean to frighten you. She nodded thank you. Her mate, however, still looked peed off. He turned to Alpha Corey. Could you point out, Lucinda was it? He asked. He didn't want to go making another mistake. Not here, doesn't attend any balls. Mated then? He asked, trying to judge if he was going to PS any more wolves off. No, just doesn't like the attention. Alpha Corey replied. I also wouldn't advise you react to her the way you did Gabby here, he said with a smile that implied Nick would not like the outcome. Nick smiled right back. I can hold my own against one tiny she-wolf. That actually made the whole table laugh. He even saw Gabby giggle behind her hand. What, you all think I can't handle a she-wolf? He was annoyed with them all. he was an alpha wolf, he could handle anything. Oh, we're willing to put money on it. Beta Adam then banged his hand on the table. $100, she bites him before he knows it. To Nick's shock, he watched as they were all betting suddenly, pulling money out and banging it on the table. 100 on her, stabbing him. Delta Pete said. 100 on her, shifting and going him in wolf form. The Gamma roared with laughter. I got 100 on his, family jewels, coping a swift kick. Alpha Corey laughed, nearly falling off his chair. He stood there and frowned at the lot of them. It completely shocked him that even the Alpha threw money down and on his family jewels at that. Luna Lindy strolled over, looked at him, looked at all of them and shook her head. What's the bet today? Nick answered her. They all think I and Alpha am a joke and won't be able to handle this she-wolf. Lucinda. Her eyes widened. Why would you need to handle her in the first place? She owes me an apology is why, and I intend to get it before I leave. I would ask politely then. Lindy smiled up at him and dropped into her mate's lap. His arm slid round her and she snuggled right into him. What's the actual bet? That she bites him, stabs him, goes wolf on him, or he loses his family jewels. He smiled down at her. Oh, I'll be in on the trying to stab him, or maybe shoot him with one of her arrows, she giggled. That would start a war with me. Nick stated flatly and walked away. He could hear them all absolutely laughing it up and talking about wanting to be there when it happens. He heard the Alpha tell them he'd link them in to make sure they were all there. Where was the respect around here? He could demand her Alpha to make her come and formally apologize. Surely she'd have to, but would he agree to it? If they were all placing bets on this confrontation, he didn't think so. It appeared to him from what he'd heard she was not likely to apologize and was likely to retaliate if he approached her angrily, and they all thought it was funny, couldn't wait for the showdown to happen, all wanted to be there for it. Who was this Lucinda and how did she get away with so much? This pack was completely backwards. The rest of the audiobook will be continued in the next episode. Join us on Patreon for early access or more great audiobooks. A link is provided in the video description.